She only had one job. One. Keep little Noah safe until his father came home. But Amy Parker was already on her knees on the cold stone floor of the Alpha King's hall, her dark hair loose and wild from the struggle, her simple servant's dress twisted at the shoulder where the Luna had shoved her back. Her arms were spread wide, one hand stretched toward Noah, one hand pressed flat against the marble to stop herself from falling completely. And her brown eyes were blazing with something that had no name, because it was bigger than fear and smaller than fury. And it was the only thing standing between the Luna and that child. Susan stood at the base of the grand staircase in her silver gown, every crystal bead catching the candlelight like she'd been poured into it. Her blonde hair was swept up perfectly. Her earrings gleamed. She looked like something you'd hang in a gallery. She looked like she was born to be the Luna of the most powerful pack in the territory. She looked at Amy the way you look at a fly on a windowsill. "Step aside," Susan said. Quiet, calm, which was the most terrifying thing about her. On the floor between them, 3-year-old Noah sat hunched with his knees pulled to his chest, his red gold hair falling over his face, his small body shaking without sound. He had stopped crying 10 minutes ago. That was what scared Amy the most. Children that age don't stop crying. They cry until someone comes. Noah had learned that no one was coming, so he had simply gone quiet. "I said step aside, Omega." Amy did not move. She had never disobeyed a direct order from the Luna. In 6 months of serving the Blackthorn pack, she had kept her head down. I'd done her work, smiled when she was supposed to smile, and vanished when she was supposed to vanish. She had followed every rule. She had swallowed every word that wanted to come out wrong. She had been so careful, so careful. But Noah's face had gone that colour, that particular pale grey colour that Amy knew. The one she had seen on her own face in mirrors years ago when she was living in a different kind of fear. And something in her that had been sleeping for a long time woke up. "No," Amy said. The word fell into the hall like a stone into still water. Susan's eyes moved to her face slowly, like she was deciding something, and then, from somewhere behind the great arched entrance at the far end of the corridor, came the sound of boots on stone. Heavy, even, unhurried. The sound of a man who had never once rushed toward anything, and because everything had always eventually come to him. Both women went still. The wolf shadows on the walls seemed to stretch. The Blackthorn estate sat on the northern edge of the territory like a crown that had fallen sideways and never been straightened. 6 stories of pale grey stone rising from a hill that overlooked nothing but pine forest and sky. Inside its walls the rules were old and they were clear. The Alpha King commanded, the Luna guided, the Betas enforced, and the Omegas, the lowest rank, the ones born without dominance, without clout, without protection. They served. They stayed quiet. They made themselves small enough to forget. Amy Parker had arrived at Blackthorn 6 months ago with one small bag, a borrowed reference letter, and a name she was not entirely sure was still hers. She was 24 years old. She had brown eyes that noticed too much, and a mouth she had learned to keep pressed firmly shut. She was not small, but she had learned to move as if she were, the way certain animals learn to walk softly, so the bigger ones don't turn around. She had come to Blackthorn for the same reason most low-rank Omegas took live-in positions, because somewhere behind her there was something she was running from. And a live-in post at an Alpha King's estate meant new walls, new routines, a place to disappear into the daily rhythm of work. It meant that for a while at least she might feel safe. What she had not expected was Noah. Alpha King Richard Blackthorn's son, 3 years old. Golden red hair and grey eyes that were exactly his father's, set in a round little face that broke your heart if you looked at it too long. His mother, Richard's true fated mate, Ilara, had died when Noah was 5 months old. A sudden illness that moved faster than the pack healers could fight. Richard had come home from a territorial summit to find his bond severed and his son in the arms of a beta nursemaid who was doing her best but could not give the child what he needed. In the Omega-verse, the severing of a fated bond was not a metaphor. It was physical. A tearing in the chest that never fully healed. A silence in the place where another heartbeat used to live. Pack healers called it the grey grief. They said the lucky ones found their way back to warmth eventually. They said the unlucky ones simply learned to function in the cold. Richard Blackthorne had learned to function in the cold. Amy had been assigned to Noah's care on her 3rd day. And that was that. She hadn't planned to love him. She didn't think she had it in her anymore, that particular kind of love, the open, helpless kind that comes with children, the love that has no conditions and no exit strategy. She had locked that part of herself away 2 years ago. She thought it was gone. Noah had found it anyway. The way small children find things you have hidden, not by looking but by climbing into your lap and pressing their head against your shoulder and saying your name like it is the whole world. She would have done anything for him. She would prove that tonight. It had started 2 hours before Richard's boots sounded on the stone. Amy had been in the kitchen wing folding the last of Noah's clean linens when she heard it. A sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a gasp, coming from the direction of the main hall. She had set down the linens and walked quickly, not quite running because running drew attention, and she had learned very early that drawing attention in Blackthorne was rarely wise. What she found stopped her in the hall doorway. Susan was standing over Noah with a grip on his small wrist, pulling him toward the base of the staircase. Noah was leaning back against the pull with everything his 30-odd pounds could manage, his face already red, his free hand pressed flat to the marble floor. "You will do what I tell you," Susan said, low and controlled. "You are not going to embarrass me in front of the council representatives tomorrow. You are going to sit still. You are going to be quiet. And you are going to smile when I tell you to. Do you understand me?" Noah did not understand. He was 3. He only knew that his wrist hurt, and that this woman, who smelled nothing like a mother and nothing like safety, was pulling him somewhere he did not want to go, and his pup wolf, still half-formed and barely controlled, was pressed so flat against his insides from fear that it had gone silent. A wolf pup's instinct, when it cannot fight and cannot flee, is to collapse inward, to disappear. Amy had watched Noah do this before, and it was the saddest thing she had ever seen. A child's wolf nature folding down like a flag in a storm. Amy was across the hall before she had made the decision to move. "Luna!" Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Please, he's frightened. Let me take him to his room. I'll have him calmed down and presentable before the morning, I promise. You won't have to." "I don't need you to manage my schedule," Susan said, without looking at her. "No, Luna. But this is his bedtime. He's tired. When he's overtired, he becomes very difficult, and I don't want that for you tomorrow. I think if we just..." Susan's eyes slid to her then. The expression in them was not anger. It was something more precise than that. "Are you?" she said, "explaining pack parenting to me?" The room went very quiet. Amy dropped her chin. "No, Luna. I apologize." "Good." Susan turned back to Noah and resumed pulling. Noah made a sound, a small broken animal sound, and Amy's entire body went tight. She stepped forward and scooped him up off the floor. She did not ask. She did not explain. She just picked him up and put him against her shoulder and stepped back with him and stood there. And her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her ears. Susan turned around very slowly. "Put him down," she said. "He's a child," Amy said. "He's just a child. Please." "You are a ranked Omega servant in my Luna's household," Susan said, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, which was worse than shouting would have been. "If you ever defy a direct order from me again, in front of the pup or anywhere else, you will leave this estate without a reference, without a record, and without anyone in this territory willing to take you in. Is that clear? Amy set Noah down. She had to. She knew she had to. She had no power here, none. But she set him down gently, and she kept her body between him and Susan, and she did not look away from the Luna's face. Set him on his feet. Susan's voice had gone flat. Amy's hands were shaking. She set Noah on his feet. He immediately pressed himself against the back of her legs and locked his arms around her knees and did not move. What Susan did next, Amy had not anticipated. She had thought there would be more words, more threats, more performance. Instead, Susan simply reached forward and took Noah's arm hard at the elbow and pulled. Not to move him, just to demonstrate, just to prove that she could. Noah cried out, and Amy went to her knees on the floor in front of him and spread her arms wide and looked up at Susan with every shred of composure she had left and said, in a voice that did not shake at all, "No." That was the moment the boots sounded in the corridor. Richard Blackthorne had not been expected home until Friday. It was Tuesday. The summit in the Eastern Territories had collapsed. A border dispute between two rival alphas had ignited into something that required his personal intervention. And then, unexpectedly, his enforcer Raymond had sent a 3-word message that Richard had learned over 15 years to treat as a fire alarm. Something is wrong. Raymond didn't send 3-word messages for small things, so Richard had come home. He was tall in the way that Alpha Kings tend to be, not the exaggerated height of someone trying to prove something, but the settled height of a man who had been big since childhood and had simply grown into it. Dark hair shot through at the temples with early silver. A face that had been handsome once in a soft way and had hardened over the years into something more interesting. Eyes that were the exact blue-grey of a sky before a storm and had the same quality. Calm on the surface, enormous pressure beneath. He walked into the main hall of his own home and stopped. He took in the scene the way he took in most things, completely and without hurrying. His son was huddled against a young woman in a servant's dress who was kneeling on the floor with her arms spread between the child and Susan. Susan was standing at the foot of the staircase with her hand still extended from whatever she had been doing a moment ago. 3 wolf shadow shapes from the candelabra behind her climbed the stone wall in enormous silence. He looked at Susan. Her face rearranged itself in the span of a breath. The flat, cold thing that had been there a second ago folding away and being replaced by something warm and startled and relieved. She crossed toward him immediately, her gown trailing on the marble. "Richard, thank goodness. I've been trying to explain to the Omega that Noah needs structured time. He can't simply be coddled every moment." She reached for his arm and he let her take it and said nothing. "I worry about how attached he's become. It's not healthy for a pup to bond so completely with a servant. You know what the old packs say about—" Richard was not listening to her. He was looking at the girl on the floor. She had dark hair that had come most of the way out of whatever she'd had it pinned in. Her dress was twisted. Her palms were flat on the cold marble. And she was watching him with brown eyes that were doing something he had not seen in a very long time. They were perfectly still, not performing calm, not hiding fear, just watching him. Steady and waiting, the way an animal watches a larger animal when it has already decided it is not going to run. His wolf, which had been quiet for 2 years since Alara died, since the bond broke and took most of what was warm in him along with it, made a sound he did not expect. Not words. His wolf never used words. But it was attentive in a way it had not been in a very long time, oriented toward the woman on the floor with the same focused stillness as a compass needle finding north. Richard noted it without understanding it and filed it away because now was not the time. He walked past Susan. He crossed to where Amy was kneeling and he crouched down, and he looked at his son. Noah looked back at him. The boy's grey eyes were red at the rims. His hair was damp at his temples. His left hand was pressed to his own elbow in the unconscious way of a child who has been grabbed somewhere that still aches. When Richard was close enough, he caught the room's scents properly for the first time. And his wolf went very still. Alpha senses read a room the way a human reads a face, layered and total, nothing missed. What he found here, his son's fear, old enough to have dried into resignation. Susan's perfume, expensive and chemical, covering something underneath it that smelled like calculation. And then, from the woman beside Noah, something he had not expected at all. Warmth. Protectiveness so fierce it had its own scent, the way certain storms have a smell before they break. And underneath that, very faint, the particular cold stone smell of someone who had been kneeling on a marble floor for a long time without moving because they had decided they were not going to. He felt something move through him like a current. Something that had no name because it did not need one. It was older than language, the thing that lived in the part of an alpha that was still wolf, the part that understood territory and pack and protection at a frequency below words. His wolf turned toward the warmth of her scent the way something living turns toward light, and Richard understood, dimly, that he would need to think about that later. "Hey, bud," he said quietly to Noah. "Come here." Noah looked at Amy first. Amy gave him the smallest nod. And then Noah climbed into his father's arms. Richard stood holding his son, and he turned and he looked at Amy, who was still on her knees. He extended a hand to her, which he could see surprised her. Her composure flickered for just a moment. And she took it, and he helped her up, and for 3 seconds, they looked at each other at adult height. She smelled like cedar and something warm he couldn't name, and she was looking at him with those still brown eyes that gave nothing away and everything away at the same time, and his wolf did something in his chest that he had genuinely forgotten it was capable of. He looked away first. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amy, Alpha, Amy Parker. I'm Noah's caregiver." He nodded. He turned to Susan. "I'm going to get Noah settled," he said. "Amy, come with us. Susan," he paused. "We'll talk in the morning." The temperature in Susan's face dropped several degrees. In the morning," she repeated. "In the morning." He carried his son up the staircase. Amy followed. Susan stood at the bottom and watched them go, and her face, just for a moment in the candlelight before she composed it, looked like something that had been planning this for a very long time and had just realized the plan might have a flaw. Noah was asleep inside 20 minutes. He had held Richard's hand the entire time Amy was telling him the story about the wolf who collected moonbeams in a jar, and when his grip finally went slack and his breathing evened out, Richard sat there for another few minutes just looking at his son's face. Amy had moved toward the door. She always disappeared when she wasn't needed, a habit so deeply trained she did it without thinking. But Richard said, quietly, so as not to wake Noah, "Don't go. I need to talk to you." She stopped. They sat across from each other in the small anteroom outside Noah's room. Richard in the chair by the window, Amy on the edge of the low bench against the wall, her hands folded in her lap. The moon was full outside and it threw blue light across the floor between them. Richard said, "Tell me what's been happening." Amy had been waiting 6 months for someone to ask her that. She had been trying to ask herself whether she would answer honestly if they did, and the answer had always been that she didn't know. She didn't know if they would believe her. She didn't know if it was her place. She didn't know if what she had seen and felt and quietly documented in her own head constituted proof of anything, or if it was just an Omega woman's word against a Luna's. But she looked at Richard Blackthorne across the moonlit floor, and she thought about Noah pressing his face into her shoulder and going silent because he had learned that crying didn't bring anyone. And she told the truth. She told him about the incidents. There had been 7 that she knew of. Noah's right wrist bruised 3 weeks ago. I explained away as a tumble down the porch steps. Noah found alone in the cellar storage room for almost 2 hours. 2 months before that, with no explanation at all for how a 3-year-old had ended up locked in a room with no light. Noah's meals. She had started checking them quietly after the second time he fell asleep, strange, too deep and too sudden, more like sedation than exhaustion. She had never been certain. She had not had the resources to be certain. But she had known. I tried to tell Beta Raymond, she said. He was not unkind. He told me I was probably misreading things, that the Luna was adjusting, that Noah was at a difficult age. I didn't push. I should have pushed. She stopped. I should have pushed harder. Richard's face during this was very still. He did not interrupt. He did not reassure. He listened the way someone listens who is gathering every word like evidence. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "You're not in trouble, Amy." She let out a breath she had been holding, she realized, for about 6 months. "I'm going to need you to stay close to Noah for the next few days," Richard said. "Don't leave him alone with Susan. Not for any reason. I'm going to ask Raymond to look into some things." "What kind of things?" she asked, because she could not help it. "The kind that should have been checked before I brought someone into this house," he said, and his voice was very flat and very even, and underneath it was something that Amy suspected could take down a building if it got out. He stood and she stood, and he said goodnight, and she went to her room. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and she thought about Noah's face on the floor tonight, and she thought about the way the Luna had looked at her over the child's head, not angry, not threatened, just calibrating. And she pressed her hand flat to her own sternum, where her heart was doing something anxious and determined and entirely new. She thought, too, about the moment Richard Blackthorne had looked at her. Not through her. Not past her, the way powerful wolves looked past omegas as a matter of course, the way she had learned to expect from her first day inside any ranked pack's walls. At her. With those storm-grey eyes, steady and direct, as if she were a thing worth the full weight of his attention. She told herself it meant nothing. He was an alpha king reading a situation. She was a piece of the situation. She pressed her hand harder against her sternum and told herself to sleep. Raymond reported back in 48 hours. Richard heard the report alone in his study with the door locked. Susan, whose legal name Raymond's contact had established, was not Susan Caldwell but Katrina Voss. Had been engaged twice before. The first engagement, to an Alpha Council member in the Western Territories named Howard Fitch, had ended when Howard died of what his pack healer had ruled an accidental poisoning. Contaminated supplements, they'd said. A terrible tragedy. Katrina had inherited the bulk of his estate through a private agreement signed 6 weeks before his death, at a time when Howard had been, by all accounts, deeply in love, and not inclined to question anything she asked him to sign. The second engagement, to a wealthy beta financier in the capital named George Watts, had ended when George had a breakdown severe enough to require institutional care. His family, suspicious but unable to prove anything, had managed to have the private agreement Katrina had procured from him declared invalid on grounds of diminished capacity. She had left before they could pursue anything further. George was still in care. His family believed he had been medicated without his knowledge for months. Raymond had also found the medical records from Noah's well check 3 weeks ago. The pack healer who had signed off on minor bruising consistent with normal toddler activity was, Raymond reported, financially indebted to a beta who was financially connected to Susan. Not provably, but connected. Richard read the report twice. Then he set it down on his desk and sat very still for a very long time. His wolf, which had been quiet for 2 years, since Ilara died, since the bond broke and took most of what was warm in him along with it, made a sound in the back of his mind that was not words but was extremely clear. It sounded like now. He asked Susan to meet him in the main hall at 8 o'clock in the evening. She arrived in a deep blue gown, her hair down, a careful soft smile already arranged. She always arranged herself before she entered a room. Amy, watching from the upper gallery where Richard had asked her to stay with Noah, close enough to hear, far enough to be safe, had noticed that about Susan from the very first week. She never just walked in anywhere. She always arrived. "You wanted to talk?" Susan said, her voice warm with relief. "Good. I think we needed this after the other night. I know you were upset, and I've been thinking about how to explain." "Katrina," Richard said. The name landed in the room like a stone. Susan, Katrina, went still. For 3 seconds, nothing on her face moved at all. Then it rearranged. And what came up this time was something Amy had never seen on her face before. Not the performance, not the warm competence she wore in public, not the cold control she wore in private. Something honest, tired, and angrier than Amy had imagined possible. "How much do you know?" she asked. "Howard Fitch," Richard said. "George Watts. The agreement you had drawn up 4 months ago that would have transferred 30% of Blackthorn estate assets to a private holding upon our bonding. The healer. The sedatives in my son's milk." At that last one, something flickered across Katrina's face, not guilt, something closer to frustration, as if she was irritated he had gotten there. "Noah was never in danger," she said. "The doses were tiny, calibrated. He would have been fine." "You were sedating my child," Richard's voice did not raise. It never did. That was the most dangerous thing about him. He got quieter when it mattered most. "For months. To keep him compliant and out of the way while you worked on me. I was managing a difficult toddler in a household where the actual father was absent for 3 weeks out of every 4, Katrina said, and there was a real edge in it now, a real grievance. You have no idea what it was like trying to establish authority in this house with that Omega girl undermining me at every... Amy protected my son, Richard said. And she is the only reason I am standing here having this conversation instead of finding out at a funeral what kind of woman you are. The silence was enormous. Katrina looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked around the hall, at the doorways, at the shadows along the walls, and her face changed. "You're not alone," she said, flat, certain. "I have not been alone in a room with you since Raymond's report," Richard confirmed. From 3 separate doorways, Raymond and 2 senior beaters stepped forward. They had been there the entire conversation, still as furniture. Katrina looked at them. She looked at Richard. And then, to Amy's complete astonishment, she laughed. It was short and a little hollow, and it was the most genuine sound she had ever made in the Blackthorn estate. "I almost had you," she said. "Oh, you almost had a version of me I was trying to be," Richard said. "The one that was still too hollow and too lonely to look closely enough. I'm sorry it took me this long." He was not talking to Katrina when he said that last part. He was looking at the floor, and then he looked up, and Amy, from the gallery, went very still because he was looking directly at where she stood in the shadow. Not past her, not through her, at her, the same way he had looked at her on the floor. "Raymond, please call the council authority." "You're not going to..." Katrina started. "Handle this quietly," Richard said. "No, because quietly means you walk away from this with a new name and a new story and find someone else whose child hasn't got an Omega brave enough to stay on the floor for them. I want your name on a public record. I want every pack in this territory to know who Katrina Voss is." Raymond was already on the phone. Katrina was taken into inter-pack custody the same night. The following morning, Blackthorn woke to clear skies and the particular charged quiet that comes after something enormous has passed. Noah ate his whole breakfast and then asked if Amy was going to read him the Moonbeam story again, and Amy said yes, and for a few hours the estate breathed. Richard's sister Cindy arrived by midday. She was 42, compact, and carried herself with the absolute authority of a woman who had never once been uncertain about her opinion. She wore dark clothes and had Richard's same storm-coloured eyes and a talent for walking into a room and making it immediately clear whose room it now was. She took one look at Amy, then at Noah, then at the way Noah tracked Amy across the kitchen with the focus of a child who has decided exactly where his safety lives. "This is the Omega girl," she said to Richard, who had just poured himself his third coffee of the morning. "This is Amy Parker," Richard said, "Noah's caregiver." Cindy looked at Amy with the focused appraisal of someone conducting an interview. "You're the one who got on the floor." "I'm sorry," Amy said, "literally on the floor, between my nephew and that woman." Cindy set down her bag. "I just want to be clear that I consider that an act of considerable courage, and I intend to tell you so exactly once because I don't believe in repeating compliments." She picked up her bag again. "Where's the room they put me in?" Amy almost smiled. Almost. The news cycle around Katrina Voss's arrest moved fast. By the end of the day, every major Interpack media channel had picked up the story. The Alpha King's intended mate revealed as a fraud. 2 prior engagements. Questions about both men's fates. Pack Council convening an emergency hearing. Amy kept Noah away from the screens, and she did not look at her own phone much. She did not have that many people who would be reaching out. That was one of the side effects of 2 years of keeping yourself small and hidden. You didn't accumulate contacts. So when the message came at 11:17 at night, she almost missed it. An unknown number. 4 words. "Saw you on the news." Amy sat on the edge of her bed and stared at those 4 words for a long time. She knew that number. She had blocked it 17 times over 2 years, and it kept finding new shapes to come back in. Harry Reid. Her ex-mate. The reason she had a borrowed name and a borrowed reference letter and 1 small bag. She had been 21 when she met him. She had been raised in a low-rank Omega community with not much in the way of resources or options. And Harry had been charming and attentive and very good at seeming like safety. It had taken 8 months for the charm to curdle. Another 4 for her to understand that what she had mistaken for love was something much smaller and much hungrier, a thing that needed her to be afraid of it in order to feel itself. She had left on a Tuesday in February with a split lip and a dislocated shoulder and the unshakable knowledge that if she stayed 1 more night, she would not leave at all. She had been running since, not running in the dramatic sense, just never quite settling, never quite trusting, always knowing, somewhere in the back of her, where the exits were. She stood up. She went to the wardrobe. She started pulling out her bag. She had her 2 sweaters and her journal and her emergency cash in the front pocket when a second message came through. "I know where you are now. I've always known how to find you, Amy. Did you really think a famous alpha's house was going to keep you from me?" Her hands went cold. A third message arrived before she could process the second. 4 hours, maybe less. "Get some sleep." She was fully packed in 3 minutes. Old reflex, the kind that lives in your hands and not your head. She had done this before. She knew the shape of leaving. She knew exactly which things mattered and which ones you abandoned, and how to do the mental math of survival very fast in the dark. She was moving toward the door when it opened. Richard stood in the doorway in a dark shirt with his sleeves pushed up, which meant he had been working late, which he apparently did most nights. He looked at the bag. He looked at the 3 messages she was still holding visible on her phone screen. He looked at her face. "Raymond flagged an unknown number accessing your public contact details from a news archive," he said. His voice was very even. "The same number tried to access the estate's registered address records 20 minutes ago through a public registry portal." He paused. "Who is he?" "How did you—" she started. "Because I've been paying attention," he said simply. "Since the night on the floor. Someone should have been paying attention long before that." He came fully into the room. "Stop packing. Talk to me." "I have to leave," she said. "I'm sorry. I'll write out Noah's full routine. Everything, sleep times, food preferences, which story he likes when he's scared, all of it. I'll leave it on the kitchen table. Amy." His voice was quiet, but it had weight. The particular weight of an alpha who was not issuing a command but was asking something, which was harder to refuse. "Stop, talk to me." "There's someone," she said, and her voice was doing something she didn't want it to do. "Who saw the news. He knows where I am now, and he's not—" She stopped, because she had never said Harry's name out loud in 2 years, and she found that she still couldn't, not easily. I need to go before he gets here. I don't want whatever comes with him to come into this house, into Noah's house. Richard looked at her for a long moment. She could feel his wolf in the room, not threateningly, but the way you feel a fire when you are standing close to it, a warmth with pressure behind it. "Give me his name," he said. She looked at him. "You are not running," Richard said. "Not from this house. Not tonight. Give me his name and let me handle it. And if after that you still want to leave, I will drive you wherever you want to go myself. But you are not leaving because someone scared you. That is not how this works here." He paused and something shifted in his face. Not command, not authority, but something personal and deliberate. "I should have told you that a long time ago. That is how it works here. You are under this pack's protection. My protection. That is not a courtesy. That is a fact." The thing about that speech was that it was not a command. It was an alpha king offering her something that was not protocol or duty, but was entirely personal. And she understood the difference, and it undid her more thoroughly than a command ever could have. Her wolf, small, low-ranked, long-suppressed, went very quiet inside her. Not from fear, from something else, something she did not have a word for yet. "Harry Reid," she said. "He's in the Omega settlements 3 territories east. He's not a wolf. He's human. He's—" She took a breath. "He hits things when he's angry. Me, mostly. For about a year." She said it the way you say things you have practiced saying matter-of-factly because it's the only way to say them without falling. "I never filed a complaint. I just left." Richard nodded once, like something had been confirmed. His jaw had gone very still in the way it went still when he was containing something enormous. "Go back to bed," he said. "Harry Reid won't reach this territory." "You don't know that," she said. And then because she had spent 2 years not trusting anyone enough to let them stand in front of her problems. "He's persistent. He always finds me. That's what he does. He waits and he finds me, and then it starts again, and I can't keep letting that happen in someone else's—" "Amy." Richard's voice had dropped to something very low and very certain, the frequency that his wolf operated on. "Look at me." She looked at him. "He will not reach this territory," Richard said. "Not tonight. Not ever. He is a human man who hurts Omega women because no one has ever given him a serious reason not to. I am going to give him one." He held her gaze. "Do you believe me?" A long silence. She had spent 2 years not believing anyone who said they would keep her safe. It was a reasonable policy, built on reasonable evidence. But Richard Blackthorne's eyes were the exact grey of a sky that has decided it is done with storms, and his wolf was steady in the room around her, and her own wolf, that small quiet thing she had been carrying alone for 2 years, was turning toward him like a plant turns toward light, helplessly, without permission. "I believe you," she said, and she meant it. "Good." He looked at the bag in her hands. "Unpack that." She almost argued. She didn't. She unpacked the bag. She didn't sleep, but she unpacked the bag. Raymond found Harry Reid at a roadside stop, 2 territories over, 3.5 hours into a drive toward Blackthorne territory, with a bag of his own and the particular certainty of a man who had never once been seriously stopped. Raymond stopped him seriously. What happened at that roadside stop? Amy was never told in full. What she was told, by Raymond himself, the following morning in the kitchen, over coffee, with the direct brevity of a man who believed in clarity, was this: Harry had signed the dissolution papers. Official, witnessed, filed with the Omega Affairs Registry. He had agreed to return to his home territory, to not attempt contact again, and to submit to a 6-month monitoring order under the Human Pack Interface Authority. He was given very clear information, Raymond said, about what the consequences of non-compliance would look like. Raymond did not elaborate on the information. Harry did not call again. Amy sat with her cup and looked out the kitchen window at the pine forest. and something in her chest that had been braced for 3 years. A held breath, a locked door, a wall she had built so slowly she had forgotten it was there, released, just slightly, just enough to feel the difference. It felt like the first real inhale she'd taken in a very long time. 3 days later, Richard came to find Amy in Noah's playroom, where she was sitting on the floor with Noah building a tower out of wooden blocks that kept falling over, and Noah kept laughing every time it fell, which meant Amy was laughing too, and it looked like the most ordinary thing in the world, and also, somehow, like something entirely new. Richard leaned in the doorway for a moment before either of them saw him. He stood there watching, the woman on the floor and his son and the falling towers. And his wolf went so still inside him, it might have been holding its breath. When Noah spotted him, he held up a block triumphantly. "Dada, look!" Richard came in and sat on the floor next to Noah and helped him put the next block on, which also fell. And Noah thought this was even funnier, and Amy sat across from them both and watched the Alpha King of the entire Northern Territory sit cross-legged on a nursery floor, making sound effects for falling wooden towers, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt, for the first time in 2 years, like she might actually be somewhere she was allowed to stay. The Interpack Tribunal convened 6 weeks after Katrina's arrest. It was held in the council hall in the capital, a building designed to make everyone inside it feel appropriately small, all high-vaulted ceilings and cold stone, and the particular hush that comes from a space that has absorbed centuries of serious decisions. A press were admitted to the public gallery. Representatives from 7 packs were seated in the formal witness rows. Cindy had arranged all of it, seating, security, the legal team, with the focused efficiency of someone who found complex logistics soothing. The lead pack attorney was a woman named Sharon Wells, 50, silver-streaked with reading glasses she wore on a chain, and a reputation for never once, in 22 years of practice, losing a case she had taken on. She met with Amy for 3 sessions before the hearing. In the first session, she said, "Tell me what you saw." Amy told her. Sharon took notes without reacting to any of it. In the second session, she said, "Opposing counsel is going to point out that you're a low-rank Omega with no official standing, and no documentation, and no pack protection." Amy said she knew. Then Sharon said, "I'm pointing it out so you're prepared, not because it will define what happens. The evidence is strong. You are the emotional center of the testimony, and emotional centers of testimony need to be steady. Can you be steady?" Amy looked at her and said yes. In the third session, Sharon just said, "You protected a child who had no one else. Remember that every time the room feels too big." Amy remembered it. The tribunal gallery was full when she walked in. The media cameras tracked her across the room. She was wearing the best dress she owned, a simple dark blue, borrowed belt, her hair pinned up the way she wore it for formal occasions. And she walked with her chin level and her hands loose at her sides, and she did not look at Katrina's table until she had to. Katrina had arrived in a charcoal suit, her hair severe, and her makeup precise. She had not been able to perform her way out of custody, but she was performing her way through the tribunal, and Amy had to give her this. She was very, very good at it. The expression she had arranged was not guilt and not defiance, but a kind of bewildered dignity. The look of someone who has been profoundly misunderstood. When Amy took the witness stand, Katrina's gaze moved to her. Amy had expected to feel afraid. She had been afraid of this woman for 6 months. She had learned the particular weight of Katrina's disapproval, the precise temperature of her contempt, the way a room changed when Katrina decided it needed to change. What she felt instead, looking at Katrina across the tribunal floor, was something quieter and more final. She felt done. Sharon led her through the testimony point by point, or Amy spoke clearly. She did not embellish and she did not minimize. She said, "On this date I observed, on this date I noticed, on this date I intervened." She kept her voice even through the wrist incident, and the cellar and the milk, that one cost her the most. The thought of it still made something in her stomach tighten. But she kept going. Opposing counsel, a tall man named Jack Fenner, who had clearly been hired for his impressive height and his air of righteous certainty, made his expected move. "Miss Parker, isn't it true that you had developed an excessive personal attachment to the Alpha King's son that had caused you to misinterpret normal disciplinary interactions as—" "No," Amy said. Fenner paused. He had expected her to stumble. She hadn't. "No?" he repeated. "A child who is calm and thriving doesn't need to be explained. Noah was not calm. He was not thriving. He had stopped crying when he was frightened because he had learned that crying didn't bring anyone. That is not a 3-year-old adjusting to a new family structure. That is a child who has been taught that he is alone. No." The gallery made a sound. The presiding council member asked for quiet. Fenner moved on. The medical evidence was presented by the pack healer Richard had brought in independently. Not the compromised one, but a specialist from neutral territory who had examined Noah's full medical history and found 3 separate incidents of what she classified as deliberately applied physical stress consistent with adult-inflicted trauma, and 2 instances in the blood work of a mild sedative compound, for both occurring on dates Amy had flagged in her account. Then the financial documentation went in. Then Howard Fitch's family's testimony, given via written statement because Howard himself was still not well enough to travel. Then the records from George Watts's care facility. Katrina sat through all of it with her bewildered dignity intact. Until Sharon stood to make her closing summary, at which point she looked at Katrina and said, very quietly, "The most dangerous kind of predator is not the one who uses force. It is the one who uses trust. Miss Voss used trust as a tool. The trust of a grieving widower. The trust of a pack. The trust of a child who did not know enough to protect himself. She did not take what she wanted from strength. She took it from grief and loneliness, and the gaps that kind people leave because they believe other people are also kind. That is not ambition. That is cruelty." She sat down. The tribunal deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on all 7 counts. Katrina received the maximum sentence available under inter-pack law: permanent exile from all registered pack territories, mandatory registration with the Human Pack Interface Authority, and a complete asset freeze pending restitution proceedings for both prior victims' estates. As she was led from the council floor, she passed close to Amy, and she paused. The guards let her pause, 1 step, 2, and she looked at Amy with those calm, calibrating eyes. "You were always the variable I underestimated," she said. Amy looked back at her. "Then I guess," Amy said. "That was your first mistake." The doors closed behind Katrina Voss. And Amy Parker, standing in the council hall of the most powerful interpack tribunal in the territory, in her borrowed belt and her best dark blue dress, with her chin up and her hands completely still at her sides, finally quietly exhaled. Noah started sleeping through the night again in the 3rd week after the tribunal. It happened so gradually that Amy almost missed the moment it became a pattern. 3 nights, then 5, then 10. Then she realized she had not been woken by his small voice calling her name in the dark for 2 weeks, and she went to check on him, and he was fine, just deeply, peacefully asleep. His pup wolf sprawled loose in his chest, with him in the easy way of a creature that has finally decided the world is mostly safe. She could feel it when she stood in the doorway. The particular warmth that radiated from a wolf pup who was sleeping without fear, a warmth that had its own scent, clean and bright, and entirely itself. She stood in his doorway for a long time. She thought, this is what it was for. Richard had stopped travelling as much. The council duties still took him away, but the 3 weeks out of 4 had become 1 week, sometimes less. He was building something. Amy understood this gradually. He was building a different version of his own life. The version that existed in the house, the one that had been running automatically for 2 years on the strength of other people's competence, while he was somewhere else refusing to come home to the space where Alara wasn't. He was not doing this gracefully. He was doing it the way men who have been powerful for a long time learn new things. Slightly too seriously, with too much deliberate effort, which was also somehow endearing. He had decided to learn Noah's bedtime routine himself. This required Amy's assistance because Noah's bedtime routine was, as Amy had documented in her 4-page handwritten guide, specific. Bath first, then the soft grey pyjamas, not the blue ones unless it was a Friday, then 2 stories, then the moon song, then 3 minutes of quiet, with the door open a crack. Deviation from this protocol resulted in a 45-minute renegotiation that nobody won. Richard had learned this the hard way on the second night, when he had attempted to skip directly to 1 story in the interest of efficiency. And Noah had countered with the kind of principled outrage that only a 3-year-old can sustain at full volume. Amy had appeared in the doorway 15 minutes into it, taken in the scene, and said with absolute composure, "Would you like me to take over, Alpha?" Richard had turned to look at her with an expression that was somewhere between humbled and faintly amused. "I would very much appreciate that, yes." "He needs the second story," she said. "I didn't know there was a second story." "There is always a second story. There is a document on the kitchen table that explains this." His voice was very dry. "It's a guide," she said, also dry, "not a bedtime contract." Noah looked between them. "Second story," he said with the conviction of a much larger person. "Second story," Amy and Richard said at the same time, and they looked at each other. It was the first time Amy had heard Richard laugh. A real one, not a polite sound but an actual laugh, low and a little surprised, like he had rediscovered a thing he had forgotten he had. His wolf warmed the room when he laughed. She hadn't noticed that before. Or she had noticed and had been carefully not noticing. She smiled back before she could stop herself. It built slowly. That was the thing about it. It built slowly, from small things, the way most real things do. Breakfast together became a routine because Noah insisted on it, and Noah's insistences were not easy to decline. The 3 of them around the kitchen table in the mornings, Noah working through his toast with focused seriousness, Amy with her tea, Richard with his coffee and whatever council briefing he was attempting to read, while being periodically interrupted by his son requiring commentary on his toast. Evenings on the back terrace became a thing. After Noah was in bed when the house went quiet, Richard would sometimes be out there, and Amy would sometimes come out for air, and they would stand with their cups and look at the pine forest going dark at the edges and talk about nothing particularly important. Except that it was important. All of it was important. The conversations that started nowhere and ended up somewhere real. About Elara, about Noah, about the weight of authority and what it cost. About 2 years of fear and what running does to a person. About what it means to not know for a long time that you are allowed to stop. His wolf was always present on the terrace in the evenings. Not pressing. Not demanding. Just there. Warm and attentive at the edge of her awareness, the way a fire is there. And her own wolf, which had spent 2 years pressed flat from fear and silence, had begun, very slowly, very carefully, to uncurl. She did not let herself think too hard about what that meant. Cindy watched all of this from a careful distance and said nothing until one evening she found Amy in the kitchen at 11 o'clock, inexplicably baking something. "What are you doing?" Cindy said. "Baking," Amy said. "At 11 at night. It helps when I can't sleep." Cindy sat down at the kitchen island, pulled one of the still warm items toward her, and ate half of it before saying, "My brother hasn't laughed like that since Elara. Not once. In 2 years." She looked at Amy over the remaining half. "I'm telling you that because I'm only going to say it once, and because I think you should know." She finished the rest of it. "These are very good." "Thank you," Amy said. "Go to bed," Cindy said. "You're not running from anything anymore. You can sleep." Amy did go to bed, and she did sleep. The evening it shifted was an ordinary one, which is often how it goes with extraordinary things. They have a way of hiding in ordinary evenings until they cannot be hidden anymore. Noah had fallen asleep mid-second story, which occasionally happened when Richard got the pacing right. They had both sat there for a moment in the small lamplight of the nursery, looking at the boy sleeping, and then they had both stood and gone out to the terrace in the easy way of people who have stopped negotiating the logistics of their own comfort around each other. The full moon was out. The pine forest below the hill was silver and black. Under a full moon, wolf senses sharpened to something close to painful, colours deeper, sounds further, scents more layered and precise. Richard had stopped suppressing this the way he had for 2 years. He let it in. And what it brought him, standing on his own terrace in the moonlight, was the warmth of the woman beside him, the cedar and warmth scent of her that his wolf had been cataloguing since the first night. The particular stillness she carried that was not timidity but was something much stronger. The stillness of a person who had chosen, very deliberately, to be calm. His wolf said, simply, her. It had been saying it for weeks. He had been pretending not to hear. Richard leaned on the stone railing and looked at the forest for a while. "I need to say something to you," he said, "and I've been trying to find the right way to say it for about 3 weeks, and I think the right way is probably just to say it." Amy turned slightly toward him, her cup in both hands. "When I came home that night and saw you on the floor," he said, "you specifically, not the situation. I knew something. My wolf knew it before I did. Before I had any words for it, before any of the rest of this." He paused. "The bond doesn't announce itself the way the stories say. It doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives like recognition. Like something you already knew, reminding you." He looked at her. His eyes in the moonlight were very still. "I've been careful because I know your situation. I know that you came here to be safe and that the last person who claimed something was yours did it in a way that meant something entirely different from what the word should mean. So I've been careful." "I know," Amy said very quietly. "I noticed." "I don't want to be an alpha king talking at you," Richard said. "I'm asking you something. That's a different thing." He looked at her. "I'm asking if you want to stay, not in the role, not as Noah's caregiver, just here, with us, as whatever that means, on your terms, at whatever pace makes sense for you. I'm asking, and if the answer is no or not yet or I'm not sure, those are all completely—" "Yes," Amy said. Richard went quiet. "Yes?" he said. "I'm not going to make you finish that list," she said. "I know what you're asking, and the answer is yes." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. His was large and warm and certain, and when his skin met hers, her wolf went still in a way it had never gone still before. Not the stillness of fear, not the stillness of someone making themselves small, but the stillness of something that has finally, after a very long time, come to rest. She did not flinch. She did not count the exits. She just held on. Down in the pine forest, a wolf called out, low, long, the sound carrying across the hill in the still night air. In the Omega-verse, a wolf's howl at a full moon meant something specific. It meant, "I am here. I am here, and I am not hiding." Amy Parker, who had spent 2 years hiding, lifted her face to the moon and let herself be seen. The formal bonding ceremony was held 4 months later, small and private, just the pack's senior members and Cindy and Noah, who wore his good clothes with the unhappy compliance of a child who has been told this is very important. "Dad, please stop tugging at your collar." Noah stood very straight through the whole thing. When the pack elder asked if the assembled witnesses would uphold and protect the bond, Noah said yes, loudly enough that the elder startled, and several people in the room laughed, and Amy, standing there in the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. A deep blue dress that Cindy had presented to her a week earlier with the instruction, "Do not argue with me about this," felt her whole face do something warm and helpless and entirely her own. When the bonding words were spoken, something happened that she had heard about, but never expected to feel. The bond settled into place between her and Richard, like a key turning in a lock that had always been there, and her wolf, which had spent 2 years curled tight against her ribs, unfurled completely for the first time, and breathed. Richard felt it too. She knew because his hand tightened around hers, and he looked at her, and his storm-grey eyes were bright in the way she had never seen them, the way a sky looks after the weather breaks. Afterward, Noah climbed into her arms and said, "Mama Amy, can we have the moonbeam story now?" She pressed her face into his hair. "Yes," she said, "we can have the moonbeam story." And Richard, Alpha King of the Blackthorn territory, the most feared wolf in 7 packs, a man who had been hollow for 2 years with grief, put his arm around both of them and leaned his head down, and the 3 of them stood in the courtyard under the open sky. A family. A real one. The kind that doesn't come to you by bloodline or by rank or by any of the rules the world makes about who belongs where. The kind you build, together, out of ordinary evenings and second stories and blocks that keep falling over, and the decision, made again and again, quietly without ceremony, to stay. There are 3 things this story taught, and they are worth sitting with before we go. The first is about courage, not the loud kind, the kind in movies with music behind it and an audience watching. Amy Parker's courage was quiet. It was kneeling on a cold floor. It was saying one word, no, in a house where she had no power and no backup, and nothing to lose except a child who needed her. Most real courage looks exactly like that. It happens in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday with no one watching, and it costs more than anyone ever sees. But it changes everything. The second is about the danger of seeing only what you want to see. Richard Blackthorn was not a foolish man. He was a perceptive, experienced alpha who had survived 2 decades of complex politics, and yet he had missed what was happening in his own home because grief had made him absent. And absence, even understandable, even earned absence, creates space for damage. The lesson here is not to distrust people. It is to stay present in the things that matter most. You cannot protect what you are not looking at. The third is the most important one. Katrina Voss could only do what she did because she understood, correctly, that a community which assigns all the power to rank and all the trust to status will reliably overlook the person at the bottom. Amy was overlooked. She was an omega, a servant, a nobody by every measure the pack recognized. And it was Amy who saw. It was Amy who stood. It was Amy who held on until someone with power finally came close enough to listen. There are people in your life right now who are telling you something true, quietly, in the ways available to them. They are not the loudest. They are not the most decorated, but they are right. Find them. Listen. Family is not always where you start. Sometimes it is where you finally stop running. To everyone who watched this story from beginning to end, thank you. Genuinely. That is not a small thing. In a world full of content fighting for your seconds, you gave this story your full attention, and that is one of the most generous things a person can offer. If Amy's story moved you, if you held your breath on that cold marble floor with her, if you felt Noah's small hand in yours during that bedtime scene, if the moment on the terrace under the full moon stayed with you, then this channel was made for you. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next story. It costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Or smash that like button. It tells us this kind of story is worth telling. And drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one, and there is something extraordinary about knowing how far a story can travel. We make these stories because we believe the best ones don't just entertain. They remind you of something you already knew but needed to hear again. That courage is possible in ordinary circumstances. That healing is not a destination you arrive at, but a direction you keep choosing. That belonging is not something you are born into, but something you build, patiently, with the people willing to build it alongside you. Amy found her moonbeam. Noah found his safe place. Richard found his way home. We hope you find yours. Next time on this channel, she was the disgraced Alpha's daughter, cast out, rank stripped, left with nothing but her wolf and her pride. He was the beta enforcer sent to escort her off Pack lands for good. But the road is long, and the bond doesn't ask permission. Join us for the Enforcer's Debt, coming very soon. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Good night. We'll see you in the next story.